Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next UK Blue Shield webinar on conflict and the risk to UK heritage. It's lovely to have you all with us. We'll just give it another couple of minutes for last minute people to arrive, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Okay, I hope everybody's had a lovely summer. Welcome back. And it's a real pleasure to kick off the autumn programme of events with Professor Lisa Moll. So Lisa has worked with UK Blue Shield for many years. She's a professor of geomorphology and heritage and conflict at the University of West England. She's an expert in heritage stone deterioration, in particular that associated with active combat. She co-directs the Centre of the Environment, Society and Resilience within the College of Arts and Technology, which fosters interdisciplinary research to enhance our ability to adapt to environmental crisis. Professor Moll leads funded projects, including Heritage in the Crossfire, and supports initiatives and colleagues in conflict zones in documentation and remediation of damage to built heritage. And if you haven't had a look, I strongly recommend having a look at the Heritage in the Crossfire website. It's an excellent resource and showcases some really fascinating work. And we're also delighted because Lisa is a trustee of Blue Shield UK, so it's really great to have her able to present one of our talks today. So Lisa, thank you so much, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to hope that the screen share is still working well. Okay. So thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Today is going to be more of a question than a comment sort of talk, but in the work that we've been doing at UE Bristol, a lot of the questions are raised around, well, what can we do to prevent damage to built heritage? Do we actually have any ways of enforcing that? How do we work with partnerships? And today I thought I would just talk a little bit around those ideas, those questions. How does the Hague Convention sort of apply to built heritage? And what sort of damage do we see and how do we cope with it? So, why isn't it? There we go. So, as I say, this is going to be a bit more of a discussion. I mean, is there such thing as proper protection of built heritage? Can we protect it? I mean, it's really quite difficult to properly protect a big building. And then whose responsibility is it to protect heritage? Because that is something that we could actually really delve into. You know, who is responsible for keeping that heritage safe during our conflict? Obviously, there are structures in place, such as looking at the CPP units. We can look at the Hague Convention. We can look towards the ICC. We can look towards the local custodians of the heritage. How do we actually make sure that the heritage is adequately protected? And can we reconcile military advantage, as it is actually laid out, with prioritizing heritage protection? Quite often there are issues where heritage sites are used as military sites, sometimes deliberately as a sort of a shielding exercise, sometimes because it happens to be a geographically very prominent position. So can we actually reconcile this? And these are all questions I'm sort of putting out there just to see, you know, what do people think? So I'm very much hoping to get a little bit of feedback on this. And also, this is something that I ask myself pretty much every day. Why are we seeing so much destruction despite the legal protections that are in place, despite the work that is being done so tirelessly by organizations like Blue Shield, why is there so much widespread destruction? And this is where we do dive into genocide, notoriously, and scholasticide as very deliberate targeting strategies that really do a huge amount of damage to both tangible and intangible heritage. And also, what can we still salvage? What can actually be done about the heritage, for example, in Gaza, where the widespread destruction is so intense that it's going to be very difficult to figure out what we can actually still salvage in terms of damaged structures. So to prepare for this talk, I went back into the Hague Convention and looked at sort of the big headlines. And you can actually see that buildings are quite prominently presented here or represented here, particularly in points 2 and 3. So to protect property against the risk of fire or the collapse of buildings. So that is very much talking about the big structures. We cannot let them collapse because they are heritage structures in their own right, and quite often they also contain very important archives of heritage, such as museum collections or archives or manuscripts, things like that. And then, and this is where we get into quite a big sticking point, developing initiatives which guarantee respect for cultural property situated on their own territory or on the territory of other state parties. This involves refraining from using such property in any manner that might expose it to destruction or deterioration in the event of armed conflict, and by refraining from all acts of hostility directed against it. Now, this is where we can see that in current conflicts, that is not really being abided by. Deliberate targeting of heritage is something that we see across Ukraine, I say across Gaza, but we also see it in many of the other ongoing conflict zones, such as in Syria and in Yemen, and in Lebanon. So there is a lot of issues that are surrounding these really great statements of protection, but that really start to run into trouble when it comes to the implementation of it. So this is just something that I wanted to flag up. Is actually when we are talking about protecting the built environment, and we're talking about all these wonderful protections that are built in legally, what do we actually see in terms of that being implemented? Now, realistically, as I say, it's really, really difficult to protect built heritage. And one of the things that I wanted to flag up as a suboptimal development is the increasing use of drones. Here's a really interesting example that I saw come around on LinkedIn, posted by Kirilo Kopstev, which is the Holy Resurrection Cathedral of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, in Sumy. And this was hit by a drone attack. And those are actually becoming very difficult to predict. So with an increasing use of drones, and we've seen attacks involving drones happen not only in Ukraine, but across Europe recently as well, with all the airports and the airspaces being disrupted by drone usage. How do we still protect against that? The face of armed conflict is changing rapidly, and maybe we need to think about how we adapt to that as heritage protection practitioners. Can we still predict strikes? Or will we just see that drones essentially come out of nowhere and inflict damage on buildings that weren't protected because they were nowhere near an active conflict zone? So how do we strategically keep heritage sites safe within this sort of changing landscape of armed combat? So can we continue to keep heritage sites protected, especially also with hybrid attacks being on the rise? Because one of the things that we need to consider is that built heritage is more than just the structure. When we talk about built heritage, we are also talking about the archives that are associated with them, like all the information about conservation and restoration work that's been done. We're talking about the history that surrounds it. And all of these things are now under attack, either because a physical archive can be under threat, but also because digital archives are quite vulnerable when it comes to disruption by cyber attacks or other slightly more subtle forms of adjustment. So, a couple of issues. And as I say, I don't want to just talk about problems and ways in which we are now struggling to keep built heritage safe, but there are some issues that we need to talk about. And the biggest one of that is that the convention is not honored by all armed parties. And this is something that we're seeing come forward very, very clearly in the conflict of Israel and its destruction of Gaza. But it's also increasingly difficult because within that armed conflict, where heritage is actively being targeted, because the convention is not being honored by the armed parties, there's also a myriad of weaponry and ammunition used. So what do we actually prepare for? All of these different weapons and all of these different munitions, they all inflict different kinds of damage, and the collateral damage that comes with it, such as, for example, fire or flooding, makes it quite difficult to really prepare for very specific types of damage and containing that damage. I say we're seeing a lot of heritage being destroyed in not only direct combat, but also as collateral damage. We're seeing quite a lot of vandalism and misuse of sites, all of which are part of that conflict damage to the built environment. So that is something that we also need to look at, is that we don't just look at exactly where a bomb drops. We need to look at human behavior within the conflict zone to see where the sites are at risk. And as I say, there's a ton of great organizations doing wonderful work documenting all these things. But the problem is that documentation doesn't mean prevention. And how do we prevent sites from being damaged because of human behavior during conflict? Another question is, well, where do drones fit in our protection? Drones are obviously used increasingly to inflict damage. Is there also a way that maybe we can use them to help protect through the gathering of information, mapping? We can fit them nowadays with things like LiDAR. So there's a lot of ways, and actually drones can be used for information gathering, but in an armed conflict environment, flying a drone is really problematic, to make an understatement. So is there a way we can work around that? And now one of the biggest ones that I've been working on personally is that when it comes to no strike zones, a lot of our understanding, or pretty much all of our understanding, is based on modern building materials. Now, if you go on Google Scholar and you look for explosive damage to building materials, what it will come up with over and over and over again is concrete. And if not concrete, then sometimes it's composite materials. We can sometimes look at things like the effects of rebar. You can look at potentially even like porcelain encasing. But when we are talking about heritage buildings, we're talking about a very different beast than a, say, military bunker built out of modern concrete. So we really need to start thinking about heritage sites, not just as a sort of site in itself, but as very fragile buildings that are really affected by things like strikes further down the road, but at a far too close a distance for them to cope with the blasts. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, because I will show you a little bit of the science that we are developing to help with our understanding of the threats that especially explosives pose to heritage sites. So as I say, the difficulty is that heritage sites and modern buildings are very, very different in the way they respond to especially blast damage. Now, here's a map that the BBC produced. This is from the BBC News website, so very much public sphere. And you can see here that this is strikes in Lebanon, and there was a evacuation zone that was set up. But unfortunately, when you look at the location of the different heritage sites around it, including the Old Town, but also the Crusader Cathedral, the Roman Baths, the Hippodrome, those are really far too close to the strike zone for comfort. Had these been modern buildings, they may have been okay, but the Roman Baths, we're talking about sedimentary stone that's been exposed for millennia, that's already become quite fragile and quite friable, and that can't cope with the blast pressures in the same way that a modern building could cope with if the bomb was, say, falling 2-3 blocks away. The other thing that we need a huge amount of really good work is that there's a lot of unexcavated heritage. And the problem is when a explosive falls in an area where there are still archaeological sites that are not excavated, the blast pressure traveling through the soil can do a huge amount of damage to these sites before we even had a chance to really fully document them. And all of those things put together means that when we are talking about protection of heritage during strikes, and the use of explosives in particular, we need to think about the distances as needing to be far bigger than when we're talking about modern building materials. And that's something that needs to be really embedded in not only military discourse, but also in the way we look at damage done to heritage during these actions. Now, one of the things that we've been looking at is blast pressure eddies. So the sort of the swirling around of pressure fronts when they get to an obstacle and they sort of work their way around it. And our research shows that outside of kill zone, which is where you expect the really intense blast pressure to do damage, even outside of that, we're still seeing changes to the nature of the stonework of our test sites. So that means that when we are talking about blast pressure moving through, say, an old neighborhood, the distance at which that blast is doing damage is far greater when we're talking about heritage materials than if we're talking about modern building materials. So just to show you a little bit what this sort of testing tells us, is that we're having to deal with an awful lot of invisible damage. You might think, well, it's invisible, and so clearly it can't be that bad. But what this means is that we are inherently changing the nature of the stonework of a heritage site if a blast pressure really changes the fabric of it through either brittle failure or ductile failure. And just to show you a little bit what that looks like, this is an extract from an article, and you can see that you either get straight out fracturing, you can get some deforming, or you can get together with fracturing, and that's really what we tend to see most in the samples that we're working with. And you also see ductile deformation, where you're actually changing the fabric of the stonework, and it either becomes compacted and in some ways slightly harder, but it changes the way that, for example, moisture moves through stone surfaces, or we actually lose quite a lot of the coherence within the porous network within stones, which is really, really important, because say this is how stones cope with things like the annual changes in precipitation that we're seeing. If you get driving rainfall, that rain will go into the stone, it's got to go somewhere, it's got to come back out again. And if we have areas that are compacted, then that moisture can't cycle as freely, and it's really, really bad for the stonework. So by looking at the way that blast pressure damages the stone, we can think about how stonework is going to respond not only at the time, but also further down the line, because heritage is about longevity. It's about passing it on to the next generation. So we need to think about this as an ongoing process of deterioration. Recently, is really showing you the changes in compressive strength. Now, the reason I'm flagging up compressive strength is when you detonate a bomb, you get a huge blast pressure wave. And that blast pressure can actually compact and really, so really compress the stonework. Now, this is actually borrowing research from pretty hardcore geology. But what it shows is that different stone types respond differently to the same blast pressure. So when we're talking about heritage stonework, we need to know not only, what is the type of stone, because then we can look at research like this to see how that stonework responds to blast pressures. But equally, we also need to think about how long has it been exposed for? How crumbly is it? How fragile is it? How weak is that stone already? How much has it been weakened by millennia worth of weathering processes? And in that case, then how will that affect the way that it responds to the blast pressure? So in summary, understanding how blast pressure moves through heritage stonework is really quite complicated, but it's necessary because without understanding how the blast alters the stonework, we cannot think about how it's going to deteriorate in the coming years. So we did some testing. This is a explosive that we managed to test a few years ago. And we built 3 different structures, 3 chimneys, to see what the effect was, in this case, of blast pressure on pennant sandstone. Now, the caveat here is that this is freshly cut sandstone. So we could only test deterioration of this stone afterwards. But it at least gave us an insight in how stone is responding, that and sort of adding to our knowledge base when we're talking about heritage stonework and not just concrete and rebar. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this bomb had a 35-meter kill radius, which means that the structure that you see circled on the left is outside of that kill radius, and therefore we would have expected to not be affected much by this blast pressure. Now, lo and behold, what we found actually, and this is work done together with Emma Cunliffe, who's very kindly hosting this, and Charlotte Brassey at Manchester Met, and then my master student, Harry Carter, did a lot of work turning a huge Excel spreadsheet into these 3 graphs. And what you're seeing here is that, as expected, the stonework that is very near the original blast point, you can see that here, 5 meters, it's the graph to the right. You can see that permeability has gone up quite a lot, which means that we have lots and lots of fracturing. And we also are seeing that actually the hardness values are higher, especially around the back, which means that there's been a lot of compression of the stonework, especially around the back of the building. And that is something that's actually quite important to remember, is that when we're talking about blast progression and blast damage to heritage, it is not just about the initial hit to the front of the building. Those blast pressures actually work their way all around the building and really alter the stonework. Now, when we move further away from the blast site, we can see that even at 40 meters, which is the graph to the bottom left, there is still quite a big difference between the front of the structure and the back of the structure, where the front has been notably weakened. You can see that by that cluster of blue points with lower values than the cluster of red points. that actually even at that distance, the stonework has been weakened by the blast pressure that hit. So our understanding of the effects of especially blasts in heritage areas means that we really have underestimated how much damage is inflicted by an explosive being set off in the vicinity of a heritage site, no matter if it is outside of the permitted strike zone. So one of the things that we really want to have a think about is then how does this feed into the long-term deterioration? Now, we're quite lucky that we have a wonderful field site in Bath, which is just down the road from UWE Bristol. And this is the stock exchange, and that was hit by a bomb 80 years ago. So this gives us a really great archive of stone deterioration associated with the heritage site over multiple decades. And one of the things that we saw is at the bottom, that's where most of the shrapnel hit, because it was a bomb that dropped on King Square about 100 meters from this particular building. So the shrapnel that that explosion sent out was mostly damaging at the bottom levels of the stonework, which are represented by cells 4 and 5 and 6. Fracture development of impact, which obviously is not a great thing for stone integrity, is much more visible in the bottom 2 sections of the building. And as I say, that's really not very surprising, but we do see that the shrapnel impacts that did hit further up have also left their mark. But we are also seeing that the harder end areas are actually nearer the corner where the building was hit. So it's a bit of an odd building in that it got pretty thoroughly destroyed, with the exception of the outside walls, which were left standing. And then since then, they've built another building inside of these damaged walls. So there's now student accommodation and a nisbet inside the shell of this bombed out building. And as you can see, we got a weird combination there of higher leap values, which are in graph B in dark blue on the corner, but we also have much higher values in terms of permeability. So what we have there is very heavily compacted stone because of the blast pressure coming out of King Square, but also an increase in fractures. You know, we get lots and lots of brittle failure in these areas in a pattern that is not as distinct around the rest of the building. So even within a singular building, we are seeing differences in how the stonework responds depending on how close it was to the blast, but also how it was then angled away or towards the blast. So when we're talking about the damage done to heritage during an explosive event, we need to think very, very carefully about how not only the shrapnel hits, but also how the pressure moves around the building, and it actually really affects the way that that building is going to respond to environmental stress after. And just to kind of give you a little bit more of an insight into the science, and this is some of the last of it. If you are interested in what we're doing, please do get in touch, because I can talk about this stuff for hours, but obviously I don't have the time to do that now. But I just want to give you a very brief overview. So we've got a little bit of a comparison here of what is happening on the wall in areas that were not directly hit by shrapnel, and areas that were where shrapnel did directly hit and it's left a crater. And you can see that there are some differences in terms of how hard they are. So we're seeing actually some higher leap values, so rock surface hardness values within the crater. So again, indicating compaction associated with this big hit of probably metal. But we're also seeing much more intense fracture networks associated with the transfer of energy at the point of impact, which then really sort of rips apart some of the stone matrix and creates quite a lot of different fractures. So it's quite complicated, to say the least, but all of these studies do give us an insight into how heritage stone responds to explosive damage and how it will then deteriorate further down. Because as I say, one of the problems is that when we're documenting war damage, we're talking about what's happened on the spot. Whereas within the field that I'm working, we're thinking of the damage as a starting point for a longer term, very much altered deterioration process that does affect the longevity of a building and therefore our ability to pass it on to future generations. And say this is something that here's the gatehouse of Al Kahira Castle in Yemen. And I just wanted to flag this up to illustrate that war damage, as I say, it's not a thing that happens just on the spot. It resonates through and it will affect how a heritage site holds up. One of the issues is that in areas where we're seeing a lot of political unrest, we're also quite often seeing long-term decay associated with climate changes and sometimes also neglect because there's been a reduction in resources, which contributes to the political instability. This is not always the case, but it is something that we have noticed working across a number of buildings in heritage in conflict zones. Now then the conflict hits, the building is damaged, and in the aftermath of conflict, try as we might, there is not going to be the same level of resources available to restore these places as you might find, for example, in the UK outside of a conflict setting. We've got to think very carefully about resource allocation. What do we allocate it to? Do we try and stabilize this castle or do we try and rebuild a hospital? And these are genuine questions that we as heritage practitioners do need to think about. What can we feasibly ask for? And then say one of the issues that we're quite often seeing is that there is a little bit of an overlap between areas where climate change is hitting really hard, usually in the form of droughts, but also changes in precipitation, so very intense precipitation, and then long periods of droughts again. We're seeing increases in temperature. All of those things are really bad for damaged stonework in the built environment. So we're seeing accelerated decay associated with the climate change pressures that we're observing in the region. So lots and lots of issues associated with our understanding of blast damage to the built environment. And as I say, then there are the issues of actually implementing the legal protections, which clearly isn't working beautifully across all conflict zones right now because we're seeing gross violations of the Hague Convention. So what do we do then? What are we left with? Documentation is quite often touted as the next best thing. I mean, if you can't necessarily save the heritage, you can at least save a digital copy, so we will know what it looked like. And it is something that has served us well, but there are issues that we need to think around. And one of them is, of course, the use of AI and its increasing ability to alter images. How do we trust digital archives when that is literally all we've got left because the original site has been destroyed? What is safe digital storage? If you send it up into the cloud, it becomes vulnerable to things like cyber attacks. And say cyber attacks are now so prevalent in this new hybrid conflict that we're seeing. But equally, if you just have an external hard drive, you've got to store it somewhere. And what if that somewhere happens to be in a conflict zone where the storage site or the refuge can also still be destroyed? And this also brings with it questions such as the use of documentation as evidence of violations of the Hague Convention. So how do we make sure that documentation is actually really the safest possible option. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use documentation, we absolutely should, but I think there are questions that we need to ask ourselves as we are building these digital archives, just to make sure that they are safeguarded. Because if not digital, what are the alternatives? Paper-based archives, again, vulnerable to disaster as well as conflict. So we just got to think about these things as we are looking at damage to especially the built environment. Because say documentation is incredibly useful for understanding the nature of the damage, but also undertaking long-term monitoring, seeing how buildings that have been affected by conflict are decaying and what sort of interventions might be needed. And I don't want you to think that I'm a complete skeptic when it comes to digital documentation. I'm absolutely not. I'm a huge fan of it because it allows me to really work in areas that are incredibly difficult to access, especially if the partners there can send us digital documentation that we then turn into 3D models. We can use it to do site assessments. We can use it to essentially do virtual field work and be really immersed in the environment without having to travel to a conflict zone, because that is not possible. UE Bristol will never let me travel into a conflict zone. It's just not going to happen. So this way, I can still use my expertise to support partners in areas that are in very difficult circumstances. And we use a lot of GIS for that. In this case, what we've done is created a digital environment, and it helps us to place the buildings not only in their sort of immediate environment, but also to have a look at how they are situated. And this helps us with doing things like environmental assessments. But it's a lot of jiggery pokery, and thankfully I work with some wonderful people at UE who are absolute whizzes at this. Who can actually take the drone footage or the other photogrammetry models and place them within these landscapes by painstakingly matching them up with the actual site. One thing that they also did for my convenience is actually put 3 different countries or 2 different countries in one bit of GIS map, so I can very easily move from one site to another to do the investigations. And I say that's incredibly useful. And we've got new technology at UE that helps us to really get to grips with the very detailed assessment work. So we've got a new facility called the Bridge, and it's actually built for digital humanities, and I've completely hijacked it because it is amazing with the sort of work that we are doing. So it's a very large scale interactive digital environment. And as I say, this is where the digitization and documentation of damage is really, really important. We can import the videos that are taken by drones, just a standard video, and as I say, turn them into photogrammetry models and get a really good idea of what is where and what is damage. And this is something that we are very strongly steering on towards now as a way of really getting a much better understanding of the impact of armed conflict on the built environment. And it does also keep track of me as I wander around using the little Xbox controller, and it helps us to actually categorize different types of damage. So we're still very much in the infant stages of this. It's under development, but it is a really great move forward for us because it really helps us to enhance our ability to provide really detailed structural assessments. So thinking long term, how does this all fit in? Because I started off this talk saying, okay, well, we got the Hague Convention, we got the built environment. Then pointed out that the Hague Convention, while a really important piece of legislation, cannot safeguard all built heritage in all conflict zones, simply because not every country engaged in armed combat respects that legislation. So long term, how do we work around that? So obviously intelligence is incredibly important. So where are the sites? And also what is the ascribed heritage value? We talk a lot about World Heritage Sites, we talk about UNESCO, but actually when it comes to the heritage in conflict zones, what we need to know is what is important and what gives people the cultural scaffold to help them as a society not move on from a conflict, but as a part of kind of anchoring them a little bit more in the area that they may have had to flee from. You know, what is important? What do we need to protect? Can we do any sort of damage reduction? Is there any preemptive methods that we can use? Can we use sandbagging? Can we remove decorative elements that are really, really important and put them in a refuge? Can we work with the parties involved to exclude heritage zones? Are there people in positions that can take those decisions that are willing to listen to this? And as I say, this is where, again, Blue Shield is doing an immense amount of work. Then, assuming that that is not going to prevent all damage, how do we best assess the damage that was done? What's the nature and extent of the damage? Can we attribute responsibility? And this is something that is more and more being discussed in the legal corridors as well. And also, is digital preservation necessary? Is there a very good reason to assume that this site may not actually survive? And can we get digital model instead? But then we really need to think about sustainable conservation. Is the site salvageable? Can we make this site work again for the local communities? So what resources are available and what approaches need to be made? Do we need to make a management plan that also includes long-term environmental pressures? So as I'm saying, this is thinking much more long-term, thinking about conflict damage as the start of a new process rather than a snapshot that we then pick up from business as usual. But, and here is where we do need to discuss some of the violations that are going on. It's very, very clearly says in the Hague Convention that the cultural property needs to be protected. So armed parties need to refrain from using such property in any manner that might expose it or to destruction or deterioration in the event of armed conflict, and by refraining from all acts of hostility directed against it. Now, a report was published by pen.org called All That Is Lost, and it came out a few days ago. And it is a really striking narrative about the heritage that's currently lost in Gaza. And one of the things that I wanted to put to the audience here, because I don't have the answers, is what can we do about this? What can we do to support the heritage that might still be there? What can we do beyond simply noting that this is lost, that this is damaged? What can possibly be done to move on, to move forward from this, not move on, but move forward from this in a way that is supportive for the population of Gaza? And if anyone has the answer, please get in touch, because I would very much like to know. This is just an excerpt of the report. It's talking about the Gaza Public Library. It's talking about bookstores. It's talking about the 7th century Great Amari Mosque, the Al-Qarara Cultural Museum. All of these sites have been severely damaged. What can we do about it? So that brings me to, so where to now? Do we know enough about damage to built heritage? Well, this being my area of expertise, I can safely say no, but we're working on it. How do we deter armed parties from destroying heritage? And let's say these are questions I'm posing to the general heritage practitioner audience. How do we deter armed parties from destroying heritage? Is there anything that we as a community can do? And how can we safely document damage? how do we make sure that the documentation that we put forward as a true representation of the heritage that was lost is AI proof, that we have digital refuges where this data can be held. And as a much more sort of blue sky thinking, is the current legislation enough, or are there changes that we as a involved group can pressure for, that we can help develop to help protect the built heritage? Because as I say, I've given you a very, very brief overview of exactly what, in this particular case, blast damage does to buildings, give you a very brief overview of the work that we're doing. Explosive damage to buildings is severe, and it's beyond the damage that we see on the spot. It is a lot of layering of very complex visible and invisible damage. And as I say, we need to think of this damage not just as what just happened, but what has this started? So, leaving you with a lot of big questions and not many answers, I'm very sorry. But hopefully you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the work that we're doing at UE Bristol. And hopefully I've also inspired you to think about potential ways in which we as a heritage community can keep protecting heritage in any way we can. Thank you very much.
Lisa, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. Now, I'm afraid since I've accidentally left on my Blue Shield International background, although this talk is part of the Blue Shield United Kingdom conflict working group activities, on behalf of Blue Shield International, I do have to say that this is a national committee talk and it does not represent the views and opinions of Blue Shield International.
It's also my views as a professor at UE Bristol.
So I'm also going to just offer a couple of comments. One is to note that whilst the Hague Convention Article 4 does clearly say that parties should not expose sites to damage and should not take sites into use that might cause it to become damaged, it goes on to note that there is an exception for military necessity. And most of my own research relates to the role of military necessity in armed conflict and its uses and abuses and the use of sites by armed forces. And I do have to agree with Lisa that there are many reports, and I would direct you maybe to the ICRC report, on the widespread lack of adherence to international humanitarian law that we see today, and a general decrease in compliance worldwide, which, and as somebody has said in the chat, Blue Shield must aggressively publicise the 1954 Hague Convention and the lack of adherence by the parties. Well, I think there's two things there. We do aggressively, maybe that's the wrong word, but I can tell you that most of my work concerns advocating for adherence to international humanitarian law and the Hague Convention with state parties and armed forces, and trying to raise standards, raise awareness, and raise understanding. But given this world that we're in, that's why people like Lisa and her work to better understand heritage damage and how we can mitigate it and how we can protect against it is so critical. Now, we've run over a little bit, so if we have time for maybe one question.
There's some very interesting conversations going on about anti-drone nets. The flagging up of HEMO, I've got nothing but good things to say about that work. It is absolutely incredible. So very, very well done there. Thank you.
Then perhaps to finish off then, Lisa, I mean, you've talked through a lot of options and there's some really good ideas. And I think there's a lot that we as professionals need to think about in order to raise the standards of our own work that you've very correctly identified. But if you had just one recommendation for something we could take away, what might that be?
I think what we need to do is think much more widely about the impact of explosive on our heritage areas. So rather than just looking at where did the bomb fall, think about what is around it far beyond what are currently considered to be areas of impact. So our no strike zones are inadequate for protecting fragile heritage buildings, and we need to start changing that.
Okay. And I'm afraid on that, given the time, thank you very much. But if you have questions for Lisa that occur to you afterwards, do get in touch. We can pass them on. And next month, I'm pleased to say our talk will be, she's running to the other one, Vernon Rapley, who will be speaking on managing risk at a major institution. The webinar will explore the critical role of major institutions in managing risk to cultural heritage during times of conflict and crisis. The session will delve into strategies for safeguarding collections, mitigating risks, and fostering interdisciplinary collaboration. It will draw on lessons learned from global and regional conflicts to help institutions improve evacuation plans, prioritisation of collections, and temporary storage solutions. It will discuss how institutions can proactively prepare for crises, engage with military and governmental entities, and contribute to global efforts to protect cultural heritage. The session will emphasise the importance of institutional cohesion, ethical responsibility, and public engagement, offering actionable insights on managing risk, overcoming barriers, and ensuring the survival of cultural heritage for future generations. And we look forward to seeing you again on October the 17th. Thank you very much.